It's my pleasure to welcome Adam here. I've been kind of like an Adam stalker since like probably the early summer when we first met Adam, and I've been after him to come and speak here at the university in SoCon for that whole length of time. You read Adam's bio. You know, who is Adam? He's the designer number one at IBM. You know, and his job, his current position is to try to design artificial intelligence for IBM, and he'll tell you a little bit about that. But you know, that's what you can read. Who is Adam? I've been fortunate, you know, to have many afternoons and evenings talking with Adam along with Ben and Nate. And if you're around Ben and Nate and Adam, and you realize my low limited intellect, then I try to say as few things as possible so that they won't think I'm a fool. But I mean, these guys, you know, are geniuses. You know, they have a look at the world that most of us don't see, and hopefully will comprehend when they enlighten you with it. So it's great to have these kind of personalities. It's what we want in the program, that we help you or want to expand your mind and not just tell you something you've already read or already heard. So today, you know, sit back, take in what Adam has to say, think about, reflect on it, ask him questions, and enjoy your time here. But flush all that stuff you've got, flush all the PowerPoints that are waiting on you, the emails, and, you know, be enlightened. So thank you very much, Adam. Oh, and Adam put on a suit for me for the first time. He usually wears a, you know, it's you know, you go to Google, you go to IBM, you go to any of these places, the JSOU guys stand out like a sore thumb because we all dress up in suits and they're looking at us like, you know, because you go there. I've never seen Adam except in a t-shirt, and it's always black. So he doesn't own any other color. So now today he shows up in a suit, and I'm sure he'll shed it as soon as this is over with. So thank you, Adam.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks. You're absolutely right. Always a black t-shirt and jeans. This is just for y'all. And if I knew that I could get away with just wearing my black t-shirt and jeans, I totally would have done it. So a little bit about me. I was designer number one into the IBM design program when we rekindled the design program back in 2013. I was asked to design our physical spaces. I was asked to create our design language in the first version, what it means to do design research, and I was asked to reinvent our design thinking framework that we have, which is, if you're familiar with design thinking, most people are familiar with the Stanford model, which has the hexagons. We worked with Stanford and IDEO and created our own, and we had hexagons, and one of the hexagons said understanding, and it took me hearing this about 5 times before I knew we needed something different. I can't seem to get my team out of the understanding phase. I couldn't get my head around that. I was like, you actively stop understanding when you're solving a problem? That doesn't make sense to me. So we created our model called the loop, which is an infinity symbol in which we observe, reflect, and make. So a little bit of background about how I got here. Past that was that we had just released the loop, that version of IBM Design Thinking. It's now called Enterprise Design Thinking, and I was asked to put my package together to become a distinguished designer. The Distinguished Engineer program has been going in IBM for about 25 years. There's about 650 distinguished designers in the company out of about 380,000 people. So this was the first time that they were going to take a look at designers as becoming distinguished as well. And it's a corporate appointment, so we're given a mission as a part of this appointment. So obviously I made it. But the mission that they gave me, and I didn't really ask for this, was figure out what it means to design for artificial intelligence. And it's an honor and a juicy problem to be asked to solve, for. But at the same time, it makes your knees quake a little bit because there's a lot riding on it, and there's so much that has nothing to do with what we're traditionally used to doing from a software perspective or an understanding perspective. So that led me on this path and how I ended up here in front of you. Now, as a designer, I'm not going to talk about the math behind AI. I'm not going to be talking about the technical aspects of this, but the human end of it. How do we actually design these systems for people, and how do we need to think about this? So when when I was first getting started, I realized that I knew enough to be extremely dangerous and not in the good way. I had a baseline understanding of what AI could do. I didn't really understand much else about it. So I shed my team of 20 people, and for the next year, as a solo act, I just went all over the company trying to get as smart as I could about the subject. And one of the first things I found was that at the time, there wasn't one central place that I could go get smart about AI, and you would figure for a company that has products like Watson that there would be a central place, but there wasn't. So I started talking to experts inside and outside the company. I started talking to clients who were interested in using it, and the one thing that became readily apparent right away was that in everybody's mind that working with AI looked something like this, that their expectation was formed around the App Store. It was an installation. You have Watson, come put Watson on our server, and we're going to be off and running. It'll know everything that it needs to know because it's artificially intelligent, right? And when you have that, the possibilities are endless. Like, we could solve for all of our problems, any of our problems. And the problem is that when you actually start getting smart about AI to really do something with it, it ends up looking a lot more like this and feeling like that, more to the point. And you go from this, we can do anything, to where the heck do we start? And so that was where I chose to focus the bulk of my attention, was how do I help a team start thinking about what it is that they're going to do with AI and how to get to a successful state with it. So I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to turn around. I'm used to having something that's right here and I don't want to stand in the corner. But the first thing I ask everybody is why artificial intelligence? And oftentimes it's something around, my boss told me that we needed to have AI, it's new, it's cool, something like that. But from a wordsmithing perspective, and I really do think that the words that we choose around these matters count, is that we're getting higher quality outcomes faster than humanly possible. And that there's so much that people read into it when you ask them, why artificial intelligence? Oh, we can see more, we can go through mountains of data, etc. It's this. This is the driving reason behind why we use artificial intelligence. And answering the question of why is everything from a design perspective, and it goes doubly so for artificial intelligence. When I talk about design, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. When I talk about design, I'm not talking about Photoshop or font choices or graphic design, making sure that things line up on a grid, and most importantly, I'm not talking about UI. I am talking about the purpose, planning, or intention that exists behind an action, fact, or material object. It is the purpose, the intent behind why we are doing what we are doing. When I talk about artificial intelligence, I'm talking about systems that are able to simulate human thought processes. This is important because, and I expect to see a handful of heads nod to this, people are very quick to conflate machine learning with artificial intelligence. They are not the same thing. Machine learning is a prerequisite for artificial intelligence, but machine learning is about applying pattern matching at scale and speed that humans are not capable of to a mountain of data to extract what we hope is insight. Artificial intelligence is applying logic and reason, simulated human thought processes to this. So when I talk about AI design, what I'm talking about is the purpose, planning, or intention behind these simulated human thought processes. This is critical because it's not about graphic design. I just say that as a warm-up. Okay, so the simple and most important thing that I can tell you is that in order to be successful with AI, an entire team, a whole team, must align on intent. And that intent is the wellspring of where you get whole team alignment. And if there is no intent to align on, then alignment does not happen. And this is critical because I'm sure each and every one of us have been in this situation where we're all gathered around a table, watching somebody give a presentation, you're being asked to do something or told to do something, and each one of us internally is coming at it with our own point of view. And that when we leave that meeting, we go off and do what we think is important to solve that problem. And the reality is that everybody goes off in 10 different directions because that's what they feel is important. When we talk about teaching a machine to think like a human or to simulate the way that we think, if the team is misaligned, there are no shortage of ways for this to go wrong. And when I say go wrong, I am not talking about Skynet. I'm not talking about the Terminator, things like that. I'm talking about failure, an inability to actually use the thought processes that you're setting up. This is one of my favorite stories around this. So the quote is, it was a lack of understanding of the process on the part of everybody. Everybody assumed somebody else knew how it worked. In Idaho, they had created an AI system to determine mental health benefits for those who needed it most. And the data set was corrupt and flawed. They had no idea how it was trained. Everybody was working in silos, and it discriminated grossly against the people who needed this help the most. When they went and interviewed the team that was working on it, almost every single person on the team says, I only worked on this one aspect or with this one algorithm. The question you're asking, that was somebody else's problem. All the way around the entire team. There was no alignment, and as a result, the people who needed the help the most weren't getting it, but more importantly, they were being discriminated against. This is critical. So when I'm talking about whole team alignment, it's the single most important determinant for success, and that when it comes to AI, there's nothing more important than a whole team aligned on a well-articulated intent. And this means that we have to be able to tell and retell this intent to those who aren't present at the beginning so that they can be brought up to speed and internalize this along the way. It is necessary to design, teach, and launch an AI with purpose, value, and intent. If you do not have the alignment, you will not get those three things which are critical for the success of this. It also helps to determine why a team would or wouldn't consider using AI. You would be amazed at how many times people come to me with problems where we go through these exercises and we talk about this, and at the end of the day, their problem could be solved with analytics. It could be solved with big data. It doesn't necessarily need AI, but this is the big fly swatter that they want to swing at every single thing that comes in front of them. Maybe most importantly, it gives equal understanding across the whole team of the why. And the why is capitalized because it is the reason you are in the room. It is the reason you are being asked to work on this particular project. And without understanding that why, the reason why you're a part of that, the reason why this project is important and the people who are using it are important, there's no way you can give people what they need to be successful. And in most cases, user needs are synonymous with operator needs. And this is important because what people need sometimes gets pushed to the side because the intent, as it's stated up front, is to use AI to remove people out of the way. And this is critical because the more we move people out of the way, we have to think about the ramifications of why moving somebody out is a good thing, or that it could end up leading to unintended consequences. So when we first started this, my effort of coming up with this platform for design thinking and artificial intelligence, there was a moment where we were working with one of our internal product teams, and they had all these lovely design thinking artifacts ringing the room, printed off on a plotter. A visual designer had done them all up. We had personas everywhere, and I said, okay, so let's talk about your intent. Why are you here? And it got real quiet, really fast. And instead of filling the silence, I let it get awkward. For about 5 minutes, I didn't say anything until one person, sheepishly looking down at his desk, said, our boss told us that we needed to do this. And we had a 3-day workshop plan to sort out what their entirety of their design process was going to be. And we ended up taking that first full day just to get to the intent. And at that point, it was literally, they didn't have it, and I didn't think that somebody would show up to one of my workshops without having an intent. And because the world was their oyster in terms of what their intent was, it took a lot of time for that team to get sorted out on what they were trying to do. But as it turns out, we were working on a project where it was a traveling kiosk, an interactive kiosk that explained what Watson is capable of doing. And in there were these 6 core intents for AI, and I was like, well, this is perfect. If I put these up in front of people, it narrows the world of possibility down to these are the 6 things that AI does best today. This list probably will change over the course of the next handful of years, but here and now, this is what AI is good at doing. And I'll go through each one of these. So first is accelerating research and discovery. So this is about being able to come through something that is domain specific in a way that is more, has more depth and more thoroughness, to be able to pull out things that you wouldn't normally see. And something that we talked about last night was, for a simple thing, is what about looking at the effects of PTSD? And not just looking at the effects of it, but identifying it before somebody exhibits symptoms of it. And if they're If we need to go through an intrusive questioning process every time you go to the doctor, what if we could get rid of that? What if we could start seeing the signs well before it starts manifesting itself? Part of that is being able to go through what you already have and use it for discovery on things that are sitting there right under our noses, but we do not have the capability to see it ourselves with the naked eye. It can also be used for strategy and logistics. This is about using ML and AI together to be able to comb through and find out what is most important to the situation that you're solving for. When we talk about enriching your interactions, primarily this is about creating a natural language interface with the machine, so being able to converse with it in natural language, whether through speech to text, text to speech, typing, it doesn't matter. It's about the ability to ask plain English questions and get plain English responses back. Really good in your case for recruiting, education, and training. The ability to go deeper and on demand, asynchronously. It doesn't have to be tied to a certain place or time. This is something that can be brought along. It can be turned into a mobile app. It can be alongside of a website. This is important. Probably the least heavy use of AI. It's more cosmetic, I would say, but does have its place. Anticipating and preempting disruptions. So this is about being able to monitor machinery and equipment in real time, looking for points of failure well before a human can notice that they're going to take place, so that you can proactively treat the situation so that you have no downtime. And obviously maintenance, readiness, and operations are going to benefit from this. And again, these are gross high-level recommendations for what these intents can be applied to, but I'm just throwing it out there. Recommending with confidence is about being able to make these confident, targeted recommendations by an AI to a human based on a number of inputs, and taking all of that and synthesizing it in real time and giving next best action instructions. So you could think of it in terms of exposing trade-offs where you have to make a decision between 1, 2, or 3 different things and which one is going to be the best choice to make. Just-in-time advice, so we see a lot in terms of maintenance, and if you're looking at a complicated system like engines or something like that, that you can diagnose a symptom that might not be the problem, and it can start making recommendations of, look in these 3 places. If this thing failed, these are the 3 next best things that you could choose to go look at, as well as simulations of scenarios. So you can play what if with this by saying, if these are all the variables that are in play, what are the possibilities that might come out of this particular situation? Scaling expertise and learning. This is great when you have an organization the size of yours, or an organization the size of mine. I think the figure is that inside of each one of our heads, there's about $250,000 worth of thought capital that's trapped between our ears that we have a very difficult time sharing with others so that they can put it to use. If you can collect that expertise from your broader audiences, it can then be called upon in just-in-time, whether it's through combining it with natural language or some of the other intents that we were talking about, so that you can get this on demand when you need it. So it's like being able to ask the one question that you need answered by all of the experts simultaneously, because all of this has been put in one place and able to be recalled. And then detect liabilities and mitigate risk. This right now is primarily based on written word. It's about policies and whether or not you're compliant with these policies, but it does a really good job of doing traces through paper trails to be able to see if the policies that are set in place are being followed by large organizations, or maybe more importantly, when two organizations are interacting with each other. Any questions so far? Super. Okay. So we came up with some exercises that get at aligning on intent. And this is one of our design thinking exercises in which we have teams diverge and converge around what it is that they're here to do. So what we ask them to do is to start with 1 or 2 of those 6 intents, and then we ask them to spend about a half an hour brainstorming on a number of different ideas that end up mapping to these top-level intents. What we do after that is we take the top-level intents away because it ends up shoehorning people into too narrow of a solution. We take those away and we start looking for overlap around what people have put up on the board, and then we create a group out of that, or create multiple groups, and then the working team votes on what will give the best bang for the buck in any given situation for the problem that they're trying to solve right here and now. And what we end up with out of this is really important. We have whole team understanding and a whole team alignment of what it is that we're trying to do. And this is really important, again, because if everybody is off doing their own thing, we could have people training and going through the data collection process to find things that aren't necessary to solve for the problem in the here and now. The other thing that's really important around having clear intent is it makes it much easier to choose the data that you're going to use to feed to the AI at the beginning. So it's obviously one of the most fundamental steps right after having a main intent, but identifying that right problem first is what helps you narrow down the data that you need to collect. And oftentimes what we find is that people either start with the technology itself, but more often than not, they start with the data sources that they have available, and they're not thinking about what they might be able to get from a public domain, what exists on the user's end at a device level, or what exists in an organization that people haven't chosen to surface yet for use around these sorts of things. And that how this data is taught to the system is going to determine what the AI is capable of reasoning through. So it's not just that you're going to teach it, but how you teach this data, and the form that the data takes dictates how you're going to train it. And typically we're taught to think of data as numbers in a table or in a database. And when we're talking about data from an AI perspective, we're talking about images and image recognition. We're talking about audio files. We're talking about video files. We're talking about a number of different things. Anything that a machine can start to make sense of becomes a data source. And so you have to think about what it means to acquire that, what it means to clean for that, what it means to train for that. So if we have intent done, now it's about rendering the intent. Another way to describe what design is, apart from the purpose, planning, or intention behind an action, fact, or material object, is design is the rendering of intent. And what I found was that when I started talking to people, and still to this day, when I talk about AI with folks, they start and end with the machine itself. And something that my team and I came to realize is that there's an actual ecosystem in which a machine needs to exist in order for it to have meaning. That ecosystem consists of the world and the business. In this case, it's not the business, but an organization, the human at the other end, and the machine. And most importantly, it's that there is the context between these four elements that gives the machine its purpose. That any one of these by itself is not enough. What I need as a human or an end user is not enough. What the machine is capable of, not enough. What the organization needs or what the world has to offer in terms of the data, not enough. It is the connection of these four things to one another that gives it its purpose. So this led us to creating the AI human context model, because we found that people were saying just slap AI in it. That was the first step of explaining there's more to it than just the technology and the machine. And so we basically rolled this thing flat, in which the business or the organization bookends this model by having intent up front, both intent for the organization and intent for the users who are using the system, and that there's an outcome in which there is a real world solution being used by real people with real outcomes. In the middle, the world is represented by the data that we can collect and the policy that binds it. So it could be as simple as weather data, it might be satellite data, it might be photos, videos, surveillance, you name it. It's the world externalized is how the machine sees, hears, and understands what's out there that we take for granted from a human perspective. We just use our senses and we take in the outside world. The machine, and this is grossly simplified, but for understanding purposes, when we're explaining this to folks, the machine has four distinct sections to it. There's understanding, which is what we also commonly refer to as machine learning. It is how you take something from data and give it to a machine so that it can understand the domain. Now, if you have a pre-trained model that exists around whatever it is that you're trying to do, you're ahead of the game because somebody else has done some of the base layer training so that the machine gets there. But 9 out of 10 times, at least at this stage, the machine can take and read that data, but until you provide the context as to how that data is important to you, your effort, and the larger organization's effort, the machine is too dumb to understand that connection. You have to provide the connection for it. which leads to reasoning, and that's the machine's ability to apply logic to what it's understood, to what it's been trained. So now it can start making reasoned decisions or choices that it can be placed in front of the end user so that they can make use of that understanding. Knowledge is the sum total of what this machine knows, and expression is the UI layer. So how does all of this get to somebody's eyeballs or ears when they're actually using the system? Again, grossly simplified, but within this context model, the human has a reaction. And typically this takes the shape of today, this worked for me, this didn't work for me, I'm not sure what you just gave me. And this is critical because it doesn't matter what software vendor you go with, what AI provider you go with, or if you're making your own. There is no feedback loop that takes that user reaction and brings it back to what the computer knows off the shelf, in quotes, off the shelf. That means for every AI system that you put together, you have to consciously add in a feedback loop if you want the machine to learn from what our use patterns are. So not only does that start to tailor the information and the responses to me as an individual, it starts to aggregate with us as an entire group. And this is valuable data that needs to be collected, but it needs to be done intentionally. There's a learning from it, and you end up with the outcome. If and when you advance past this point, the idea is to create feedback loops between knowledge and the understanding, reasoning, expression, as well as the user interaction, because this is an opportunity for the machine to leverage every aspect in that feedback loop so that it is constantly combining these variables together in a way that it can come up with novel answers that are unexpected, that provide value. And we have to be able to tell it that it provides value, because if we don't, there's no way the machine can learn from that. So we took this and we tried to explain this to folks in workshops, and people started to glaze over when we were actually doing the exercises, somewhere right around here. And we also found out that it wasn't worthwhile to have teams try to design how this was going to look or behave on a device in a workshop. It wasn't the right place or the time to do it. So what we did was we took the first 5 elements and we created a design thinking set of plugins. It's like an AI platform for our design thinking platform. Based on these first 5 things, and we slightly twisted it in terms of what I just described. So in plain English, intent is like, as the group, we're answering why are we doing this and what are the big ideas that support this effort. From a data and policy perspective, is like, what data do you have to bring these particular ideas to life? And this is important. So one is like, there's an idea behind this, there's an intent behind it. Now you can start being focused about the data that you're collecting. This is more or less going into the tactical aspects of what do we need to take from that data to teach to a system or to a model to be able to deliver the results that we expect. Reasoning is our best expectation of how the machine will apply logic to that. And it used to be in the early days, so like I said, we did about 35 prototype workshops to get to the finalized product here. And we didn't really know what to say, because what do you say? It's like, well, this is everything that the machine knows, and we didn't really have a workshop for it or an activity for it. But as we had been developing our own AI ethics content, we figured out that this was the best place to start introducing ethics into it. So we're answering the question, if you succeed, what are the implications of what your AI will know? And we thought that this was really critical, and it turns out that people really appreciate this. That it is really easy to get a team aligned on intent if you're actually following through this. It is easy to be able to spec out the data sources, and then you can start figuring out what it is that you want to do to get the machine to understand it. But it's very rare that while we're still at a post-it note stage, while we're still at a discussion stage, that we're actually tempering our enthusiasm for what we may have come up with to say, what are the long-term and short-term possible ramifications for this if we do succeed? And this has really helped teams narrow down what it is that they choose to work on, because oftentimes the biggest idea that they're driving towards, they don't know what the outcome is going to be, and it helps them to scope down that initial effort, because one of the things that we've also seen is that it's super tempting for a team who's getting started with AI to want to apply this to everything, or the whole organization, or an entire system, as opposed to starting in a very small place that has bold possible outcomes. So this is the whole platform. We have exercises on intent, ideas, data, teaching a machine to understand, how to have it, what we think it's going to be able to do in terms of forming its own hypotheses and recommendations, tracing these two back to what we've done for the morning. The other thing I should mention on this is that originally in its first incarnation, we thought of it as a 5-day workshop, and we realized that that was too much to ask of any one given group because people's time are valuable. And so we took it down to a 3-day exercise. We are now confident that this can be run in 1 day and you can get the same results out of it. So we trace back what we talked about in the first part of this workshop so that we can see, do we have the data sources that are available, or is it something that we wish we had or that we could maybe potentially get over the course of time. We create a reasoning statement, and then we do this layers of effect exercise up here where we talk about and think about what are the primary reasons we're doing this? Well, that should be answered by a lot of what we do in the earlier section of the day. The secondary are what we wish would happen, but we're not entirely certain if it's going to play out the way that we expect it to. And the tertiary layer is where we're thinking about the unintended consequences and what we could possibly do about it going forward. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about how I ended up with all of this. When I first started, one of the things that I was taught is that what separates a machine from machine learning, an AI from machine learning, is that it has the ability to understand, reason, learn, and interact. And this would not leave me. I mean, yes, that's pretty simple to understand, but I kept writing it down everywhere. I kept trying to make an acronym out of it early, that sort of thing. And I didn't know why it was sticking with me the way that it did. And then one morning I had a true shower moment. I was waking up, hot water's hitting my head, and I realized that human to human, if I can understand where you're coming from, and that doesn't mean that I have to agree with you, but if I understand you, and I can reason about what you're talking about, and I can learn from you while interacting, well, this is the best reason for me to want to cultivate a lasting relationship with you. Because if I'm getting these qualities from you and I'm giving them back, there is a relationship here that we take for granted. This is what happens when we form our relationships every day, and nobody ever points this out to us. So this brought me to the realization that we are entering the relationship era of computing. We are currently in the transactional era of computing, in which there is some form of input field and a submit button. You put that in, you hit submit, it goes to the back end, it gets taken apart, it gets put back together. The result is put up on the glass, transaction complete. Well, what happens when the machine is understanding what it is that we're trying to do and trying to reason through what it is that we're doing and learning from us each time? This is now the beginning of the capability for us to form a meaningful relationship between a human and a machine. Which means to design for this, we have to know ourselves better than ever before, because oftentimes we aren't, well, just about all the time, we're never taught this is what a healthy relationship looks like. These are the components of a healthy relationship. We simply model what our parents show us, what our siblings show us, and what we do with our friends. So the foundation of a healthy relationship, as far as it goes between a human and a machine, is that there has to be purpose. This is a reason for the user to engage with the machine, and this will shift and grow over the course of time, because as the machine starts out, it will not be as intelligent as it will become one day, and therefore the purpose and what it's capable of doing will shift and change as it grows up. Second is value. There has to be an intrinsic benefit for the user to engage with this system. If they won't, they will reject it. And this is really critical because we are now judging it based on intelligence, not on capability. And we have very high bars that we all set for one another about who's an idiot and who's intelligent. And if this is in a system, more often than not, our first reaction is going to be, this system is an idiot. And as I was stating earlier this morning, we all have smartphones. On those smartphones, you have about 5 pages worth of icons on there. Everything past that second screen is like broken dreams, where You had some big hope for what that app was going to do for you, and then you quickly forgotten about it. And one of the things that I started thinking about is, what happens to all of these broken AI if they don't have value? What are they doing? Do we decommission them? Are they sitting somewhere on a server still learning? Nobody has answers to these questions unless you start asking those questions. And last is trust, and this is the willingness of a user to invest in an emotional bond with the machine. And to trust this, I mean, we all trust the technology that we have. In some cases, maybe we don't, but we know where our trust level ends. Again, if we know that a system is intelligent, the level of trust that we are willing to invest is actually quite low at first. On our first interaction, what we might find is that we want to give all of our trust to the system. So what do? We ask the hardest question that we can think of coming from our own expertise. If in that first interaction the system can nail it, we are willing to go along for the ride. So what do we do next? We ask it the hardest question that we can think of that has nothing to do with the domain expertise whatsoever. Who won the basketball game last night? And we want to see how it fails, because part of this is how we fail as human beings is as much a predictor or an indicator of our own intelligence as the actual intelligence that we show. This is a symbiotic relationship because the human has to augment the machine before the machine can augment the human. And this is another very important point. There are no AI in existence today that come off the shelf that are preloaded with everything that you need to know. And sure, there's things like Siri and Alexa and Google Assistant, but those are like what I call pocket AI, in which they can solve for or answer very narrow questions, and it's more of a one and done variety. You know, what's the weather? Here's the weather, and then it goes away. I wanted to make sure that I was checking my math properly. I have a background in psychology, and so when we were coming up with purpose, value, and trust, we felt like we were pretty spot on with it. But I was doing some reading, and there's a professor who turns out is in my backyard at the University of Texas in Austin. His name is Mark Knapp. And in 1972, he created this relationship escalation model. And there's another half to this where it's the relationship in a de-escalation mode. It's hard enough to just generate this, so I left that half out. If you're interested, go do a search on it. To explain this really quickly in terms of like a cocktail party, initiating is what you would be comfortable sharing with anybody about who you are and what you do and the basic trivial aspects of your life. So you meet somebody for the first time. Hi, I'm Adam. I work at IBM. I'm married. I have dogs. I have kids. I live in Texas, that sort of stuff. Experimenting is where we try to figure out, do we have commonality with this other person? What are the things that you're interested in? What do you do when you're not at work at IBM? Oh, well, I like to do, I don't know, let's say gardening, or I listen to death metal, or I ride bikes. And you might be thinking, like, I can't grow anything to save my life, and I'm definitely out on the death metal, but bikes, I like riding bikes. And so then we start figuring out, is it mountain biking or is it road biking? And intensifying is when we figure out that we both like to do road biking, and how about next Thursday? We go on my favorite ride. I'll take you on my favorite ride. And if it all goes well, integrating is where we do that a couple times, and you say, you know what? We should do this every Thursday, and I'll go on your rides and you'll go on my rides, but more importantly, let's start making new rides together. And bonding is where we take our relationship past those shared activities and start bringing it into other aspects of our lives, where we're celebrating holidays together or we're spending time together on the weekend. It's not just around biking, it's that we've bonded over deeper and bigger things than a specific subject or activity. And it turned out that purpose, value, and trust mapped almost perfectly on this, that when we're developing our own relationships with each other, that initiating and experimenting is where we are trying to find the purpose for this relationship to exist. And you know, we've all had that same experience too, where you're at a cocktail party and you have like this much of a drink in your glass, and you start talking to somebody and you know there's no connection there, and you're just waiting for that last sip so you can be like, I'm gonna go get another drink, and then never return back around, right? We're looking for purpose. Does this person interest me? Do they have shared common interests? Value is where we're intensifying and integrating. We're saying there's a reason for me to continue along this path. And trust, obviously, in bonding, and the important thing to note here is that trust doesn't just show up at the end. It accrues over the course of time. Now, when I talk about relationships, I'm talking about these deep, meaningful ones, but we also have meaningful micro relationships is what I call them. So like, if you go to Starbucks every day, there's probably a barista there. You have to go every day. And they will know your name, and they will know what you want, and they write your name on the cup as you're ordering, and maybe you don't even have to order. They just know what you're going to want. You always get the same thing to eat and the same thing to drink, and they put it through, and you pay your money, and maybe you smile, give a wave, and you talk about the weather for a second or two. Then you pick up your stuff and you leave. Well, if you go one day and that person isn't there, you have this moment that flashes through your head, which is, oh man, I gotta teach this brand new person how to make my stuff. It's like none of this is critical or cosmic, but we do have that knee-jerk reaction where we feel like, oh, my buddy isn't there, even though they're not your buddy, and you probably wouldn't recognize them if you saw them outside of that Starbucks. But that's still a meaningful relationship that we do assign some importance to. So it might be that some of the systems that we create are there just as these micro relationships, whereas others will be the centralized relationships for what it is that we choose to do. Now, this is the part where I say to you all, nobody here disagrees that this is a bird, right? And that birds do fly. Yes, right, check. And that this is an airplane, and yes, in fact, airplanes fly. This is the part where I also point out that organic flight and mechanical flight are two very different things. Both have their pros and cons, but they don't operate the same way. And this is the same thing that we have to recognize when we're talking about artificial intelligence, that mechanical intelligence versus organic intelligence are two very different things, and they operate differently. So we've started to hypothesize about what this relationship model looks like when we're actually performing it with a machine in the loop as opposed to another human being. So if we pull this back up again, when we're talking about initiating, it's the system being able to establish tone, personality, and presence. And this means I know if you walk in the room. I also know if you call me on the phone or if you send me a text message. I know that there's something intelligent, someone intelligent that's reaching out to me. That is presence, that there is an intelligence present in this. Experimenting is where the system is able to display provable authenticity of its own interactions, and this is what I was talking about. If I'm a domain expert and this machine is supposed to be an expert in the domain, I am going to test whether or not it meets my definition of what intellect is. I'm also going to be able to draw a line in the sand where I can say, okay, it's smart about these things, but if I push it past this level, it still doesn't understand what I'm talking about yet. Now, I draw this line here because this is pretty much where the industry has made it to so far. We haven't gotten past this. This is where all of those pocket AI exists, even the stuff that we make, the stuff that Google makes, Microsoft makes. We're all at this level right now. When we talk about intensifying, we're talking about being able to deliver multi-step context-aware interactions. So right now, you ask Alexa, what's the weather outside? She tells you the weather, and that's it. Imagine coming home and asking Alexa, or telling Alexa, I'm hungry, help me make a decision for dinner. And she comes back and says, well, what did you have for lunch? And now she's starting to apply context. She knows that we as humans eat this thing called lunch, and that generally, and maybe you're different where you have like pizza every meal, but generally, we all like to mix things up. So she's trying to place the context. What did you have for lunch? Oh, I had pizza for lunch. Well, how about that burger place that I recommended last time? Did you like it? No, it was actually kind of crappy. Oh, so now it's starting to apply more context to it. And now it's this back and forth where it starts to become more like a real conversation instead of us barking orders at this thing to turn on the lights or to tell us what the weather is or to tell us a joke, or if it's like my kids, to make fart noise. This is probably the most hypothetical one. So when we talk about integrating, there's a couple groups in IBM that are playing around with this idea of establishing this fully realized shared profile between an AI and a human. So imagine if you're in my shoes and that what I had to do was sort of go through a form of speed dating or get to know you with every single person in this room. It gets exhausting having to tell my story over and over again. If I'm going to make an actual connection with you as an individual instead of here standing in front of you giving a presentation, it gets exhausting. And if you think about all the different places where AI is going to touch us, if as an organization, as a group, you're not thinking about how all of these AI will play together, you're going to end up having to introduce yourself to system after system after system. And if there's a core system in which you have taken the time to train it, that it's learned from you based on your interactions passively and actively, then why shouldn't that be able to be saved and read by another system? So in effect, you could make instant best friends with the next system that comes along. We're playing around with this as an idea, but it's still at the hypothetical stage. And then, as far as bonding is concerned, nobody knows what this looks like. And if you've seen the movie Her, that's probably the best representation. But unless anybody here is willing to date their operating system, I'm guessing that none of you know what this is like either. But if you do choose to date Windows or your Mac OS or whatever it is that you use, please get in touch with me. I would love to do an interview. Okay, so our progress to this human-machine relationship goal is like here, like right there. You know, we are just on the beginning of this path. And what I recommend to everybody as we're talking about how we form these relationships is that you think of the AI that you're working with like this, that we can say the words artificial intelligence and AI over and over again. We have over and over again to the point we are desensitized to what it actually stands for. We are intentionally bringing into existence a secondary species of intelligence. And right now, we are at the Apple IIe era of AI, where all of the pieces are scattered on the table. You got to put it together, and somebody says, what are you going to do with the computer? And you go, I don't know, I have to write all the programs that run on the thing too. This is sort of where we are with AI. At some point, it will make its way into like a smartphone level of advancement. But if we're talking about intelligence and true intelligence, then we don't throw out our children because they're not born as PhDs, and we don't lose patience with them because they don't learn everything right away. What is it that we do is we teach them what's important to us as their parents. We show them examples of what we think is good behavior and how to treat other people. And that means that we have to teach machines what we value. This is a foreign concept when we're talking about how to make software, because software doesn't care about what we value, it's what we tell it we value. We have to teach it what we value, and what we value sometimes shifts and changes based on the situation or the person that we're talking to. These are not black and white things. And more importantly is that AI might uncover things that you don't want to know or see. And then the question is, what is it that you do with it? Because once you know it, you can't unknow it. You can't just stick your head in the sand or bury it because the machine uncovers an insight that you weren't aware of. And this goes right back to our value system. Sometimes it's an individual person, sometimes it's the value system of an organization. It's not sometimes, both. It's both. That those have to be accounted for. And if you have no plan in place or no way to discuss this, you will not know what to do when the time comes. And more importantly, you won't be able to talk about this prior to it occurring. And this, I can't make this point strong enough, is that this ethical decision making is not another form of technical problem solving. This is hugely important. It is not something that we can fix with a flow chart. It's not something that we can discuss in terms of agile scrums or something like that. It is a profoundly human moment for us to talk about what we think is ethically correct in the way that a system works. That's why my team, somewhat reluctantly at first, created this guide called Everyday Ethics for Artificial Intelligence. This is one of our 4 main public-facing statements on AI ethics. You can download this and you don't have to worry about writing it down. I'll give you some URLs at the end that you can, when you can't take pictures, you can write it down. When my team first started on this work, we had created some material around how to design for conversation, how to design for insight extraction, and knowledge bootstrapping. And I kept getting phone calls from all over the company saying, when are you going to do something about ethics? And I was like, I'm not doing something on ethics. I'm not an ethicist. And this woman, who is now a team member for reasons that will be obvious in a second, she called me up and she said, you doing anything with ethics? I said, no. She said, well, who is? And I said, well, Francesca Rossi is our global lead for AI ethics. And she picked up the phone, called her. Half an hour later, there's a meeting on my calendar that I have with her and Francesca 2 days later. And by the end of that half-hour discussion, I had agreed to make this document. And the birthplace of this was that I had read and a bunch of us had read IEEE's Ethically Aligned Design document. If you haven't seen this, I strongly recommend downloading a copy. It's free. It was created by a coalition of some of the greatest minds in artificial intelligence and ethics, as well as artificial intelligence ethics. It is thorough. It is about 275 pages, not including all of the links that are contained on those 275 pages. And what I had realized is that that would require everybody, let's just say in this room, to have read that document, internalized that document, and then have the expectation that the people sitting on either side of you had done the same thing, and that you were going to all start behaving that way the following day, which I know is just unrealistic. It's too much to ask from people. So we created this instead, which is 30 pages. It's meant to be able to be read in one sitting. It hits some of the higher points from the ethically aligned design document, but it also lines up with what we're trying to do from an IBM perspective. There are 5 basic focal areas when it comes to how we put this together. Each section has a set of recommended actions that you as an individual can take right now to start furthering your knowledge about this as a subject. It then has things for your team to consider. And last and perhaps most importantly is a set of questions that are recommended that you bring up with your team. And they're not meant to be every possible question that you should ask about, say, like accountability or user data privacy. But what it does is that when you ask 1 or 2 of these questions, it invariably brings up another 50 questions, and you start realizing how much you haven't thought into the future about what the ramifications are of the system that you're creating. We've actually created an entire separate workshop. We have about 25 different exercises that are just on ethics, and something that we have to point out to folks quite frequently is that you can't bolt ethics on after you've built it. You can't add in a sense of right or wrong, or at least that line that gets drawn that says on this side of the line is what's acceptable and on that side is unacceptable. You cannot add that in at the end. You actually have to think about this before you get to the place where you're writing code or you're training data into the model. We have things like this. But most importantly, the most important thing I can leave you with is that when you're in doubt, design for the people first, not for the technology. Understand that why, and the why almost always ends up with another person at the other end, not that we successfully launched a piece of software. If you're interested, and I don't know why those colors are changed up there, but if you're interested, if you go to ibm.com/design/AI, you'll find everything that my team has made so far that we've been able to publish externally. Some, there are things that are on the way, like all of those ethics exercises. We have yet to publish those. But you'll be able to download the document. It's online as well, the ethics document. And we also have the ability, if you're interested, to get badged in our AI design course as well, which we have video content as well as workbooks that you can download and all that sort of stuff as well. And this is all publicly available. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. Thank you very much.
We have time for Q&A and microphones on either side, so if you just, when you get a question, identify yourself and then we'll get a mic to you.
We'll come up there next.
You said that ethics were not to be bolted on at the end of an AI design. What about another factor like security or integrity of the design? Because someone coming in and compromising the machine, if there's already trust and relationship at the end of it, someone compromises it, the machine gives a result, the user trusts it, but the machine is given a result based on a modification of that machine that we don't necessarily want.
Correct.
Is cybersecurity?
It should be thought of up at the very front. And that is how the data is ingested, where it's stored, how the machine accesses it. Yes, all aspects to it, which if I broach that subject, I'd be up here for like another 45 minutes. But yes, you cannot bolt security on at the end either. You must be thinking about it. There's a lot of moving parts in there, especially when you get into the reality of, you know, I made it simple by giving you a bunch of nicely colored shapes. When you actually get into the guts of what needs to be done, you have to do that up front. You can't just bolt it on at the end. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey, sir. I've had, in my previous assignment, I had the privilege of working with Maxar, developing machine learning algorithms for detection of objects in satellite imagery. I say that because I still have an incredibly hard time conceptualizing the difference between machine learning and AI. In your example of the interaction, trying to determine what I want for dinner, you know, and the question about what you've had for lunch. At some point, at some stage, somebody somewhere has decided that a variable associated with what you want for dinner should be what you have at lunch. And I imagine, and maybe this is, you know, kind of where I'm going wrong, that a, you know, software engineer or a coder somewhere has put that in as a variable to look at, rather than the machine itself figuring out that that variable exists and should be included. Is that accurate? Could you kind of follow it down a line?
Yeah,
a
so when it comes to machine learning data preparation and training, something that occurs frequently is overfitting, where too much data is used and we try to tell the machine too much directively around how to look at that data. And the reality of it is the more that we overfit and the more that we introduce extra variables in there, we're more or less saying, I want you to think exactly the way that I think, which is missing the point. You know, when it comes to, I want you to find all images that look like a stop sign automatically, sure, you're going to put that variable in there and then it sifts through a bazillion photos and it pulls out all the pictures of stop signs. But what about other, you know, I noticed that there are these triangular shapes, you know, what are those? Now you have an opportunity to say, well, that's a yield sign, or that's a warning sign, or that's a pedestrian crossing. You may not have thought about it, or you may not have even been looking for those other signs. You were just asking for the stop signs. And I think this is where this is an important distinction to make is, if I'm following what you're asking, what you're saying in so many words is, I know what I'm looking for, and I'm confident that what I'm looking for is the only thing that's important to look for, as opposed to, I'm looking for these things, and I'm also interested or curious to see things that I have not been able to see yet. And once that's stated, sometimes you may say, oh, well, that's a yield sign, or those are other types of traffic signs. There are going to be lots of examples where we're going to say, you know, funny, I don't know what that is, and now I got to get a group of people around to look at what that thing is because we've never seen that before. And that can take the shape of an object like a sign, a shape or something like that. It could take the form of a human face, but it could be behavior patterns. It could be disease states. It could be things that have a gross impact on the way that humanity lives its lives. But if we're constantly overfitting and telling the machine what it is that we're looking for without having it at least entertain what the unknown is, we won't get there. So maybe in certain use cases it does make sense to do that, but my opinion is there are plenty of opportunities even within this room to identify the unknown, or at least to have it signal there's something that you weren't expecting.
Go ahead.
Hi, thanks again for that. I assume from your discussion with ethics and values that there's no international regulations in place to prevent against the more nefarious intents?
No.
And if not, is that something our governments are looking at, proposing?
Yeah, I don't know that anybody's looking at that right now. In fact, some of what I've seen actually runs counter to that, because the corporations don't want to be told this is what you can and can't do, because then it stifles innovation and tells them where they can and can't play. And so I think there's going to be a tug of war that occurs between government regulation, and to the best of my knowledge, there is no government regulation of any sort out there. I think probably the closest thing that looks or smells like that is GDPR. New Zealand has another sort of Bill of Rights around data privacy that's similar but not exactly the same to GDPR. But unfortunately, I think it's going to take some event that catalyzes the governments of the world to make a decision to regulate that. I think until something negative happens, everybody's adopting a wait and see, and there's no shortage of things that you can read from experts all over the world, Elon Musk being one of them, saying like, we're dabbling in things that we shouldn't be dabbling in right now. And I think until somebody wants to go from an ethical stance, which is a shared understanding of what we all agree to be right and wrong, to somebody says this is right and this is wrong, you know, I don't know what the path is. And again, I'm not an ethicist, so I don't know where this is going to go. But my feeling is, I think there's going to have to be some event that triggers that.
One over there, and then we have one down here next.
Sir, thank you. I work on the China campaign team, and we look at a lot of the activities that China is engaging in with smart cities and their technologies. My question to you is there, what little I know about AI, is there just a pure advantage in numbers and the fact that China has 1 billion people and we don't, they have more data points? Is there, so are they always going to be at an advantage because they're going to have a lot more data points than we have? Or is it like population sampling? At some point, is there a point where you just have enough data that the machine cannot get any more intelligent than it already is?
Well, I don't know. I don't know about the last part because I don't know that we're not even close to seeing a machine being at its most intelligent. They're all fairly, for as intelligent as some of them are, they're all fairly stupid. Sample size doesn't necessarily mean, you know, bigger is better. It's that you have enough that's clean and accurate that it can make the extrapolations that need to be made in order to make either a projection or a suggestion. At the same time, we're talking about China. They have like 22 million CCTVs, and they have very good facial recognition, and they're basically using that to subjugate the masses by their social capital system. And if you ever watched Black Mirror, it is literally an episode of Black Mirror in which your behaviors and your actions are tallied up by everybody around you, and the lower your score is, you can't rent cars, you can't buy houses, you can't live in certain neighborhoods, and that's playing out in real time there. So, you know, it's a little bit on the ethical side, a whole lot on the ethical side, but it's what you have is also matched with how you use it too, and what you choose to use it for. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about the scale of their data, it's more about what you choose to do with it.
Got a question. So for differences where there's a corporation which culturally has a long history, I used to work at IBM as a co-op back in Drexel, and you know, there was a focus on the value of data and turning it into information and knowledge and applying it. If you have an organization's culture which is radically different, which is focused on discrete, extremely rapid actions where, you know, they don't keep the data and information history, it's not managed, the culture of the organization is very independent-minded people, so you've got that islands of information all over the place and nobody's responsible, there's no holistic understanding of how to make the data meaningful to these different stakeholders in the organization. So in other words, there's very little infrastructure here to actually use the data to create information from it. So what do you recommend where, you know, if you're giving this talk to, you know, Fortune 100 companies, this is a radically different culture in terms of the data. So what do you recommend to start the process?
A culture change effort. I mean, ultimately, if you need the data to be successful and it's locked away in silos for one reason or another, and it doesn't matter why, as soon as our adversaries choose to consolidate data or share data across organizations, there's going to be a leapfrog moment in which they can move faster and be smarter than us, and then there's no choice Do you want to wait until that happens, or do you want to start thinking proactively about it? And if thinking proactively about it means that you have to start having frank discussions with each other about what it means to actually undergo culture change, it's never comfortable. I mean, my own parallel, I was talking about it when we were on the way in the door just now. I've been with IBM for 18 years, and I've been a designer for all 18. I almost quit my very first week at IBM because I was told, oh, you don't belong in this meeting, you just make things look pretty on the way out the door. And I was like, I'm not gonna work at this place. They don't have any value for design. And I made a decision to say, well, I think it's because people don't understand why design is valuable, so it's now my job to start spreading this word, and I don't care that I have support from above, like my boss wasn't gonna, isn't asking me to do this. I just started telling a story, and I figured out that if you put me in front of a client and I could be one of the first 2 speakers, I could change the course of the entire day by talking about design the way that I talked about design. So I end up in the position that I am right now, and if you had told me 7 years ago that there would be 200,000 people as design thinkers, that there would be people who sit at the table along with our distinguished engineers, that there's an IBM fellow who's a designer now, I would have told you that you were insane. And the reality is that what we've done and what we're still continuing to do over the past 6 years is a massive culture change effort across 380,000 people in 171 countries. Is we had to change people's mind as to why design was a critical part of the way that we were going to succeed in all aspects of our business. Whether you're going to try to evangelize design in the organization or you're going to institute a culture of sharing and to do it responsibly, it is not impossible. It is individual behaviors and stances that prevent these changes from happening. And the ability to change culture rests in the narrative and the stories that you tell. That if you make it compelling enough, if you make it simple enough, if you make it easy enough for people to pass on the value of your message, you really do have the capability to change the cultural fabric of the organization in which you work. It's not going to be easy, but it's something that is doable.
Right. You talked a lot about ethics. Is that to get after human bias, and are we building human bias into these systems?
So that's one aspect of it. When we talk about explainability and transparency, bias is a part of that. A lot of people like to focus on bias, and one of the things that we find to be somewhat problematic around having a discussion that fully equates bias and ethics is that bias as a human condition is physiological and psychological. It's a survival mechanism. I mean, we are biased to have a fight or flight response to certain external stimuli. And there is no possible way for us to be without bias. There's no possibility, therefore, for a machine to be without bias. The question that we have to have is, what do we do with the bias? What do we choose to minimize the bias to a certain extent? And then we start getting into discussions about, and it's something that's being discussed in a number of places, is can you train the bias out of a machine so that the machine can do the training for you? But that is giving up a certain level of control that I don't know is necessarily the best thing to do. But it does involve that. And part of it is just making people aware that it isn't, sometimes people equate bias to a lowest common denominator, that it's around skin color or race or gender or things like that. But we have like in-group, out-group biases where it's like if you're all sitting here together because you're all working together and you're friends with each other, the bias is for you to think that what your group knows is more important than what this group knows next to you. So it's like simple awareness of a lot of this thing lets us ask the question, like, are we behaving like this? Because most of the time the bias is unconscious. We're not consciously saying like we're trying to be biased. Sure.
I had a sort of a similar question that goes to your comment on the importance of how data are taught to the machine. How are you, or are you, factoring in human emotion into those teaching methods?
Very limited at this point. And the reason being is that machines don't have emotion. So you can teach it, this is what happiness looks like, and feed it 1,000 pictures of somebody smiling or people having a good time. it's whether or not it can assign an importance to that. So it is something that my team is profoundly fascinated in, where emotion fits in all of this, because right now, a machine cannot desire an outcome because desire requires emotion, right? It means that I want this thing more than I want that thing over there. And a machine doesn't have these capabilities. So we may be able to simulate it at some point well into the future. And sure, we can do like real smoke and mirrors type stuff, like, you know, do sentiment analysis. Is this person in a rush? Are they in a particularly cheery mode, or are they down in the dumps, or are they angry, and are they heated? Because we can look at the words that you choose and make some divination, and then have the machine respond in kind. And we may accept that as an emotional response back, but it's a trick. So until we get to the place, which we may never get to, where we know that a machine can feel something, I don't know that we know what to do with our emotional output insofar as what the machine takes into account.
So question over here. So one of the most important things you said today was to design a relationship with the AI, we need to know ourselves better than before, which is understanding the people and the psychology and how humans work. What's been the response when you tell people that, you know, when you work with these big groups and they say nothing but, you know, blockchain, AI, machine learning, and you say, hey, we gotta learn about people first. What are they telling you?
Much to my surprise at the beginning, this was one where there was like nothing but net. Like I never heard anybody say like, you're talking about the wrong things. More often than not, what I hear, especially if I talk to a group for the first time, is none of this ever crossed my mind. I never even considered any of this, and thank you for making me aware of it. Some groups will take to it completely, you know, they bring it all to heart and they start operating like that, where they're actually asking these questions of each other and the whole team. But by and large, there's nobody who's doubting it. It's thank you for shedding light on this, because I wasn't thinking about it like that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Don.
Hey, sir. So my question builds on the last two, basically, is how confident are you that we will ever have clean enough data to get beyond machine learning, in your words, you know, the fairly stupid and basic systems that we have right now, into systems that can replicate human thought processes?
Well, simulate human thought processes. Replicate is way out there. I'm actually fairly confident. This is literally a matter of time, and that it's a learning of how we approach the efforts, and that given that there is significant overlap in the way that all the major vendors and the people who are creating AI tooling are thinking about it, because underlying it all is algorithms, and sure, you can have proprietary algorithms, but there's a lot of shared algorithms there. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of how people are addressing the root of the problem. I think we are, you know, probably years away from somebody having one of those, you know, sea change moments where they get a result. I mean, so you could look at DeepMind, you know, beating the world's Go champion, or taking it another level further and having it play StarCraft and beat all of the experts at StarCraft, and you say, okay, well, that's interesting. In fact, with the StarCraft example, is it figured out a way to cheat by exploiting a glitch in the machine, which is still valid, right? It's still valid. And you say, okay, well, there are things that starts to smell a little bit like what we're talking about. And I think we are not as far away as some of us might think in terms of that leap from machine learning to a true AI. I mean, we do have aspects of it that are showing up today. Not that far.
There's one up here,
Sir,
and then one down.
In the AI race that's ongoing, who are the major corporate players and who are the major government players outside of the U.S.?
I couldn't speak to the government players, but as far as corporate players from established, you would have Google, Microsoft, Facebook, IBM, probably one or two others. I don't know how much Oracle is doing. I know Salesforce has Einstein as their AI. And then there's a number of startups like Cognitive Scale and H2O.ai that are people in both cases. So Manoj Saxena left IBM and started up Cognitive Scale. Jeff Jonas left IBM, started up H2O.ai, and there's people from all the other big players that are also wanting to move a little faster than what corporations allow, so they're going and starting up their own companies. But there's no shortage of players in this field right now.
Right here.
Yeah, so is there an intent that you know of with all of these players in the AI world right now? Is there an intent to create a one-size-fits-all AI design framework, or is there going to be a specific AI design framework based on each specific customer?
I don't know anybody, I don't know of any discussion around creating a solitary framework for designing for AI. I mean, it's the same thing as design thinking, that there's 100 different offshoots that people practice and modify, whether it's from places like Stanford or IDEO, which is evolved out of Stanford, or people have adapted ours already as well. When it comes to designing for AI, I think everybody is still figuring out what to do. We have ours publicly available, and the reason it's publicly available is we want to spur others. We feel that the framework to get people thinking about this is the most important thing, that if we can share this with as many people as we can, that even if you take it and modify it for yourselves, it's that the thought and care that went into understanding how all of this plays out gets adopted by people. And I think it goes back to some of my earlier messaging, which is the most important thing that you can do in adopting anyone's framework is understanding why that framework was created and why they were applying it, why they're applying it to the places that they are applying it. That if you simply pick up somebody else's method, it may not yield the results that you're looking for. I don't know that there is any such thing as a one-size-fits-all, because much of how you use any framework is dependent on the culture of the organization. And then, as we've seen over and over again, we were talking about this last night at dinner as well, is in the early days of our design thinking platform, we would stop a conversation in mid-sentence if somebody said, well, tell me about your design thinking methodology or process. We would stop it right there, whatever we were talking about, and we would say, it is not a process or a methodology, it's a framework. It is not a set of checkboxes to say, like, you did this, you did this, you did this. It's a way for a team to adapt for their own behavior and their own purposes, to be able to think broader and outside of the box for whatever problem that they were solving. And what we've seen is, for all of the groups that are out there, just in our software products alone, it's hundreds of groups, thousands of products. And each one of those teams, so let's say it's like a team in cybersecurity. One team will practice it differently than another team, but they have a shared understanding of, this is how we adapted design thinking for our group, but this group uses it like this because they only have 3 people, and this group over here has 15 or 20 or 100. So it's adaptable from our perspective. It's not about dogma and getting it out as far as it can go. You're welcome.
Thanks for coming.
Sure.
So you talked about the technology of AI is sort of in its infancy right now. I'm kind of curious, looking forward, 20 years, what are your thoughts on, or what keeps you up at night in terms of a nefarious use of the technology or any doomsday type scenarios? Thanks.
Yeah, so I worry less about the killer robot Skynet Matrix problem, and I worry more about a machine or a system that slips its leash, that it's doing something that it was asked to do, but it goes beyond what we would consider an acceptable limit or threshold for doing that, and in the process either over-consuming resources, over-directing people in the wrong way, giving people bad advice, or basically it wouldn't be a self-preservation statement on the machine's part, but more about, I must continue doing what I was asked to do. That scares me the most. More short-term is that there are groups of people like this that are rushing to fit the pieces together to see results without thinking of the ramifications of what they choose to do, because this is unlike other computing paradigms that we've seen so far, in which we enter a set of variables look for patterns in those variables and expect answers out of it. This is much broader in its nature, and it's going to show us things both enlightening and horrible about us and the human condition. Something that I've said in other presentations, I've had slides for this, is that I see AI as a version of what happened when the electron microscope was introduced years ago, right? So with all of the refinement possible, you know, the first light microscope was 1912 or 1914, somewhere around there, and it was capable of delivering 5x human sight. And with all of the successive improvements in technological capability, that no matter how much we improve the light microscope, it's only capable of showing us 1500x, which is still cool because we can see like cellular structure, you know, cell walls, and we can see that cells exist. That's good. In the early 30s, the first electron microscope is invented, and it shows us life at 400,000x, which is well beyond what a light microscope can show. But it's another 20 to 25 years from the invention of the electron microscope to George Palade using the electron microscope and discovering the Golgi apparatus, and therefore discovering the ribosome and understanding that this is the power plant for all cellular biology, which unlocks a completely new understanding of how we create and manufacture pharmaceuticals, how we understand the human condition and cellular breakdown and all these other things. And now we're at somewhere like, I think the strongest electron microscope is at 4 million X at this point, which gives us mastery over the material world at a molecular level, which allows us to make and create substances and structures and products and things that we couldn't even possibly dream of before. Now, if you apply this to AI, this is about an electron microscope for the human condition, that we are all very content to live our lives in the way that we live our lives, and we can draw and trace back some of the roots of our behavior to our schooling, our parents, our upbringing, our environmental surroundings, how we were raised. I think there are multiple successive layers that go down way deeper or way further out, depending on how you look at it, in terms of how we connect to each other, how we operate as a herd or a flock that we don't see right now, because each one of us, we see ourselves as being individuals. And even if you're in a regimented organization where there's rank and file, we still operate in certain ways that we're not fully aware of. And I think as we start to be shown these opportunities, it will literally change the way that we think about our place in society and how we operate with each other. That's pretty heavy for You're all exhausted? Is it lunchtime? Do you eat at 11:30?
I do have one question.
Oh, there we go.
Back to where do you start? So as an organization, where do you start? And I think you very subtly said, look, if you can solve this with analytics, solve it with analytics, right? And there must be a hierarchy of solution types, right? What's your point of view on what types of decisions that we're trying to make would be most applicable to sending teams off to work on this, maybe thinking a lot slower about stuff, as opposed to our day jobs?
Sure. So I think, well, our goal, what we've been working on for the last 6 years, is to make this an aspect of your day job, not an adjunct to your day job, but that it is the way that you operate while you're trying to solve problems. And you know, how a request gets placed or put in front of you as an individual or a team can literally take just about any shape or form, right? So if the request is made, if you're at the top of the pile, you get to make the decisions for everybody else. It's your job to take a deep breath and say, before we start rushing towards a specific solution that we are predisposed to think about immediately, let's think about the people at the other end and what do they really need? Because when you start talking about what a human need is, the human need is not based on a technology. It's not based on an approach or a method or a framework. It's based on, I gotta get my job done. And I gotta get my job done to the best of my ability. And if you manage those people downward, you want to get efficiency, accuracy, or whatever metric you use to measure what success looks like for you. So if you're at the top, it's your goal to say, let's stop and take a breath here. But if you're somebody who's in the middle of the pile, to make that suggestion, if you're at the top of the pile, it's to hear that call that says, let's stop and think about this from a human perspective. And again, you know, I can't underscore this enough. That is a cultural change that whether you're in the, you know, medical, pharmaceutical, healthcare space, there's a lot of hierarchy, especially with doctors and how much schooling they have and tenure and that sort of thing. If you're in the military or in the government, there is inbuilt structure there. So part of what you need to do is to create the levers for culture change to exist. And sometimes that is simply the admission, like we were talking about earlier before this session. One of our central tenets for design thinking is fail fast. And then parenthetically, just don't cross the finish line in a failure state. But when I said this to my boss originally, I said, I think we have to make failure acceptable at IBM. Right now it's not. And he said, well, do you want to say that to the CEO? And I thought about it a second. I said, yes, I do want to say that to the CEO. And we have accepted that. It's now accepted that we are allowed to fail. And I think that is a huge enabler for what people can actually end up making decisions based on, because once you have that, you're willing to entertain the absurd. By entertaining the absurd, you can slingshot up into these really brilliant, fantastic ideas. There's all sorts of stuff that you can read about from that. I think IDEO did a whole paper on that. But really, and most importantly, this is about culture of behavior change. That if you hear somebody, or if you enable an entire team to check each other on this, that if you hear somebody go, okay, great, we're gonna buy this software package and we're just gonna apply it, to enable people to say, wait, hold up a sec. Let's take a deep breath and let's think about what it is that we're trying to do and what our desired outcome is, and then we can work backwards from that.
So part of my duty is to keep us on schedule, and so we're at that point. When I started, I said the objectives of the program were to inform, educate, and inspire, and so you delivered on all three.
Thank you very much.
Please give a warm